Welcome back to From the Region with Richard Giragosian. This week's program will consist of three specific themes or subjects. The first will be looking at recent developments in domestic politics in Armenia. The second will look at trends in terms of social and economic problems and developments in Armenia. Third, we will look at some deeper structural challenges and problems facing Armenia's development today. But first, we will start in terms of a look at domestic political developments, and there are some new developments. The reason as well is because one of our most popular shows in this program has been when we examined and assessed the role of the oligarchs in Armenia and the relationship between business and politics. But looking at recent developments, it's no longer business as usual. And in many ways, there is an interesting development concerning the future role of so-called oligarchs and their political power. Specifically, there was a press conference this past week by Ruben Hayrabetyan, a member of the Armenian parliament, but also a very wealthy businessman. Mr. Hayrabetyan, also known by his nickname Numets Rubo, is actually the chairman of the Armenian Football Federation, similar to Gagik Tsarukyan, who's also the chairman of the Bargavach Hayastan Party, Prosperous Armenia, who's also a businessman and recognized or admittedly an oligarch. Tsarukyan is also the chairman of Armenia's Olympic Committee, which is interesting that the oligarchs have not only assumed a political role as members of parliament, but have adopted the trappings and the tributes from society in terms of chairing the Football Federation and the Olympic Committee. In many ways, not earned by merit or by competence, but more as an additional award from the state for their allegiance and, in many ways, financial support. But let's look first. Ruben Hayrabetyan, twice elected to the Armenian parliament, not very articulate, not known to be very interested in politics or legislation. He is the latest and most recent so-called oligarch to announce that he won't be returning to politics. He will not run for re-election to parliament. This is not business as usual. This is part of a new trend to put a new face on the Armenian parliament in next year's election. It's also a reflection of the Armenian government's decision to pressure or persuade these oligarchs not to return and not to assume their parliamentary mandates. What's interesting about Hayrabetyan is he follows a similar decision by Samvel Alexanyan, also known as Lufik Samvo, who also owns supermarkets, real estate, and many business interests in Armenia. Alexanyan is also now being pressured not to return to parliament, mainly because the face of parliament has become in many ways a business club. It is not a serious body for legislation, and in many ways has stained and tainted the reputation of the Armenian National Assembly. What's interesting, however, is the role of a third oligarch, in terms of politics, but also in terms of economic development, or I should say the lack of economic development. This third oligarch, Gagik Tsarukyan, the chairman of Prosperous Armenia, Bargavach Hayastan, who himself models his own personal political style on Silvio Berlusconi, the oligarch prime minister of Italy. Tsarukyan will be continuing to lead his party into a new political conflict and a mounting conflict between Prosperous Armenia and the Republican Party. What's most interesting is there is a new development in this context and in this conflict between Serge Sargsyan, the president, and his Republican Party versus Prosperous Armenia, led by Tsarukyan, but widely seen as a political creation and vehicle of former President Robert Kocharyan. And this new development pertains to an interview former Foreign Minister Vardan Oskanyan gave to a leading Armenian daily newspaper, 168 Jam. In this interview, Oskanyan announced, predicted, and welcomed the return and political role in the future for former President Robert Kocharyan. This is very interesting that it was former Foreign Minister Oskanyan, which served as the messenger and the vehicle for heralding the political comeback of former President Robert Kocharyan. What's interesting is This is a real and much deeper conflict between two presidents, between the former president Robert Kocharyan and the current president Serge Sargsyan. What this is also about is not just a political battle between prosperous Armenia and the Republican Party, but a natural rivalry between the former and current presidents. In many ways, what's most interesting is politics in Armenia is increasingly about the three presidents. The first, Levon Ter-Petrosyan, the former Robert Kocharyan, and the current Serge Sargsyan. What this also reveals is the closed nature of the Armenian political system, where politics in Armenia is about the three presidents. Ter-Petrosyan as the first, Kocharyan as the former, and Sargsyan as the current. This also demonstrates the problem of Armenian politics, where the real conflict is among and between personalities, and is not a debate or a fight over policies or ideology. What is also interesting is that the potential return to a political role directly by Robert Kocharyan will be the one trigger that may upset the rather fragile and weak balance of power in terms of Armenian politics. In other words, it is generally accepted that the Republican Party is now in conflict with prosperous Armenia. And it is a conflict by proxy, by agents. In other words, by Tsarukyan as head of Bhargavach Hayastan and others in the Republican Party. But the more direct conflict now developing is between Sargsyan and Kocharyan personally. And this is most interesting because both Moscow and Washington in many ways do not favor the return of Robert Kocharyan to politics. Because in many ways, Russia and the United States can understand and even accept a rather weak Armenia. But they would not want an unstable Armenia. And the potential return to politics of Robert Kocharyan would be the one trigger that may lead to serious upheaval and perhaps revolutionary reaction among the population, mainly because of March 1st and the post-election crisis, but more importantly, because much of the legacy from the Kocharyan government was one of economic problems, corruption, and unacceptable arrogance of power that has come to haunt and plague Armenia today. But leaving that aside, the other interesting development has been Levon Ter-Petrosyan, as the first president now engaged in a dialogue that is set perhaps soon to resume between the government and the opposition Armenian National Congress. Levon Ter-Petrosyan had an opposition rally last night. In many ways, Ter-Petrosyan's recent opposition rally announced a new call for civil disobedience. This was very interesting, but also rather doubtful. The time for civil disobedience was 2 years ago, was in the aftermath of the post-election crisis. And without a clearly defined strategy and without a set of clear and coherent tactics, a call for civil disobedience at this time will probably not work. But what's interesting as well, in addition to the domestic political developments, is looking at the socioeconomic conditions. Because what we have politically, in many ways, is a stalemate. And it's no longer just a conflict between the opposition and the government. The more important conflict, and much more significant, is the conflict and the clash within the government itself, within the political elite, between prosperous Armenia as the number 2 party in the coalition, and the Republican Party and Serge Sargsyan. But in terms of economics, it's the economic crisis as well that also threatens to undermine stability and security in Armenia. More specifically, we see dangerous trends in rising levels of public debt, which will be gifts from the current government to generations of Armenians to come. What we also see is rather marginal level of inflation. But much more dangerously and deadly is significant rises and increases in food prices, which is due mainly to the hold over the market economy in Armenia by the oligarchs. We also see mounting disparities of wealth and income, both in terms of economics but also regional geography. Disparities of wealth and income between the Marzes or regions of Armenia and Yerevan, the capital. The other important economic problem that is coming is the challenge of pension reform. Pension reform in most Western market economies is the biggest challenge and problem, whether it's Social Security in the United States or pension payments in France, Greece, and the European Union. What we see in this context is Armenia has deferred dealing with the problem, but pensions and the lack of sustainability in the pension system is a serious and mounting challenge that will face this Armenian government and the next. What we also see is disparities of wealth in particular, because wealth in Armenia is much more personal and much less state resources or state wealth. In fact, we see egregious or sometimes outrageous displays of wealth, but among the oligarchs and personal individuals, rather than a wealth of state resources or an increasing budget of the Armenian government. What's also important here is the third aspect of today's program, deeper trends. And there are two specific deeper problems and challenges facing Armenia today that will become much worse over time. The first is science and education. Science and education during the Soviet period was actually very impressive. Soviet Armenia had a very high level of investment and productivity in its science and technology sphere. In terms of the independent Armenia, and especially over the last several years, science and technology has been seriously neglected in terms of state investment. The spirit of entrepreneurship, of innovation, of discovery in science and technology is Armenia's weakest link in terms of its need for economic development. It's also put a number of scientists out of work. There's been a personal and a social price to pay for the underinvestment in science and technology. It also resulted in making Armenia much less competitive in terms of economics and regional dynamics. The second, and probably most important longer-term problem, in addition to science and technology, is the education sector. Education in all countries is the one area of the economy and society that represents an investment for the future generation of Armenians. The future of a country depends on how much is invested in education and how high the standards of education are. In Armenia, the problem of education is also a problem of a lack of opportunity for recent graduates from universities. But more importantly, education has long been an area of corruption in the Republic of Armenia. And unfortunately, due to poor and inferior quality of teaching and textbooks, the education that is currently offered in Armenia today is woefully insufficient for meeting Armenia's demands for an educated and competitive workforce, as well as for creating a new class of young intelligentsia or intellectuals. And in terms of investing in the future, these two longer-term problems will determine the nature of Armenia in the future and the nature and scope of the challenges facing the Armenian governments to come. Hence, we need to address longer-term structural problems now in order to prevent a fuller-scale calamity in the future. Thank you for watching, and until next week.